All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gilbert Rotich. I'm from the University of South Florida. I'm a PhD student working under the Computer Vision Group and as well as under the University of South Florida Institute for Artificial Intelligence. It's led by Professor Lawrence Hall and Professor Sudeep Sarkar, who also happens to be my advisor. And the current work that we do there is mainly dealing with AI to deliver more precise medical image analysis for satellite image understanding, to enhance computer vision and pattern recognition, as well to model information flow across social media for robotics, to understand more model spatial information in animal brains, in the design of autonomous agents, and to model human cognition and perception. We have funding sources from these projects. For these projects include DARPA, NSF, NIH, DoD, and so on. And for me particularly, I'll be talking today about satellite imaging for understanding. This is work that we started working with quite recently. We got introduced to this work through a challenge by ARPA called Functional Map of the World. And we thought that it was a really cool concept. Us being from mostly computer vision, and with deep learning, we saw that this was an opportunity to kind of explore remote sensing. And so we kind of saw this and we took a stab at it because we understood that the goal was, could we build algorithms that can automatically classify and detect facilities, building, and land use given multiple bounding boxes in images. The main reason why we thought that deep learning might be a good idea is because, number one, it had shown good results when it comes to dealing with big data, and in this particular data set, it had a million images with 62 categories, so it was pretty large and expansive. We kind of came up with an idea or a framework, a deep learning framework that we had called Hydra. We utilized multiple deep neural network architectures, mainly which are like state of the art, known as the ResNet and DenseNet, and so we combined them to kind of get the scores there. Additionally, we kind of went further with this research by including what we call pattern theory, or using human knowledge to kind of improve our results, and we saw an increase of 1%. And in terms of reduction of error, we saw that there was a significant stunt. So for example, this was essentially the theory. So we had an input given the bounding boxes. We kind of had models trained using both ResNet and DenseNet. We fused that, and then we included pattern theory and ConceptNet. So ConceptNet is essentially it's a knowledge graph that is data mined from Wikipedia, Wiktionary, DBpedia, and so on and so forth. And so it has some of this knowledge, essentially just encodes human knowledge in a graph, or it's human knowledge encoded in a graph. And so that's what the output would look like. So essentially, ideally, there's some relation towards a shopping mall and a parking lot garage. There's some kind of work that's there. So we continued on forward, and then we stumbled upon this data set called XView from, I think, Defense Innovation Unit. And we saw this as a way to kind of push forward in the work that we had done. And for this particular instance, the goal was to, before we were given these bounding boxes, but this time around we weren't given these bounding boxes. So is there a way that we can kind of come up with algorithms to detect and also detect and classify these objects? And so at the end of the day, we were able to, for example, that would be an example of an image without anything. And we detect those bounding boxes and classify them and get what we call a confidence score. So this sometimes was used to threshold. So if it was very, very low, then we would be like, would not be too certain that there's an object there, and that was the class. So the data set itself consisted of 1,431 images. They belong to 60 categories, and they're divided into subgroups based on their sizes. So from what we saw is that dealing with high resolution images, satellite images, we saw that certain objects appear smaller while others appear larger. So a cargo plane is obviously larger than a small car or a passenger car. Those things, so you can actually see them. And then there's certain occurrences that were rare and some are common. So like buildings in metropolitan areas are quite common, and certain trucks are not common. So this was some of the things that we kind of we found interesting in the challenge. The challenges of this data set itself overall, when you look at it in the form of whether it's computer vision or deep learning, there was a large class imbalance, which I'll show next. We had partial occlusions, so sometimes there are objects that were under a tree and you could only see a certain fraction of it, or the image was cut. There's also dealing with deep learning algorithms, there's generally a limit to how big your images can be. And so the images that we got were quite large, and we kind of had to find a way in order to deal with that, to deal with them or process them in order to feed them to the architectures. The second last one was variance of object sizes. I think I've mentioned it. Planes and cars, and so also we had in terms of categories where we had a number of different trucks, which were we have a different type of trucks within one data set. And the last one was limited computational resources during inference, which I'll kind of discuss that for. So one of the things we can see is that if given the distribution of the number of classes and number of instances that appear, you can see that it's very unbalanced. Like there's some classes that there are quite a bit, and the other ones are very few. And so this was a challenge, and this is just a general challenge in deep learning and computer vision, where you have to make sure that your model does not fit towards one of the higher occurring classes. Additionally, we can see that in terms of categories, visually there are some similar classes, like where you have a small car and a passenger car. Trying to differentiate that is kind of difficult. We have 6 different types of trucks, I think, or more. And so that's trying to define what type of, or classify what type of truck it is. That's a very big challenge. And so this is also the object size variance, how big each of the objects are. And this is important because when it comes to deep learning algorithms, we have these things called anchors. And so in traditional object detection and classification, when you look at things like MS COCO or whatever you have, those anchors are more towards those sizes, and those sizes don't vary too much. But in terms of remote sensing images, whether they're high resolution, you find that they vary widely. And so those anchors might not fit exactly to how you want them to fit during training. And so it might cause a little bit of problems where you miss certain small objects. And so that's kind of important. And also, speaking of some benchmark data sets, like the difference between, let's say, this data set with ImageNet would be that there are more objects. So for example, in ImageNet, there'll be about 400,000 object instances, while this had about 600,000 object instances. So this provided some good research material and ideas and challenges. In terms of partial occlusion, we had, as I mentioned before, we had partial occlusion where we had clouds that would appear, and from what we saw, the models were actually pretty good, and they were robust in being able to identify objects, detect and classify objects. And so even though it did pretty well, this was one of the challenges. One of the major challenges as well was the large image sizes. So we were kind of, because let's say, for example, if you look at a ResNet or a DenseNet, they only take about 300 by 300 pixels, generally, or up to 512 by 512. But when you're getting images of size 3,500 by 3,500, it doesn't work. It's not going to work. So we have to be able to figure out a way to kind of be able to get the image to kind of put it in the pipeline of training. And one of the things was downsampling, but we realized that downsampling is not really the best idea because it kind of, you lose a lot of pertinent information for training. And so maybe we came up with we kind of followed the idea where we have to split images. But it was provided, but what happened is that we realized splitting the image, sometimes the corners were left out. So the corners, whether it was the top, left or right, it was left open, or some of the objects were cut, the borders were cut, and then detecting those became an issue where you have multiple bounding boxes. And so the solution that we came up with was using overlap. So for example, the top image, you have, that's no overlap. We split the image with no overlap. And the second one, at the bottom, we have overlap, but you can see that it's well well more evenly spaced out, and you can actually see we kind of capture some of the images that were cut out. The images are a little bit too small, but there's some objects that came out pretty well from that. So this was one of the things that we did to kind of help the training process. For the particular challenge, one of the things they had was limited computational resources. So we're not using a GPU. We're limited to only CPUs, which is quite a big challenge because usually, even during inference, you really need a GPU to kind of quickly iterate through the images. And so sometimes if you have huge models, this can prove a little bit challenging and it takes a lot of time. And so you have to be careful, you have to kind of balance out the size of the models that you use and actually what the performance is. So you have to evaluate the cost performance to see whether it's worth kind of using GPUs, CPUs, or whatever you might be thinking of using. And so for this particular instance, we had very limited resources for what we wanted to do. And so, but it was one of the challenges. So we proposed a challenge that, we proposed a framework, that consisted of splitting the image, which is the pre-processing part, augmenting it into different scales, splitting it. So this was going to help in terms of capturing the idea behind it, or the logic behind it was, it helps us capture the small objects as well as the large objects whenever you're splitting. And so it would help with that. We would then implement a deep learning approach, whether it's single shot multi-box detector or YOLO. And the reason mostly for this particular choice was because we wanted to get really fast algorithms without losing too much performance. And so this one's kind of showed the best performance versus time costs or time constraints. And then pre-processing, post-processing, which was a difficult and uphill battle, because what happens is that once you get what we call the region proposals, you get a lot. So I spoke about the anchors before. You have 9 anchors, and for each image it has 9 anchors, and then you have, let's say for a high resolution satellite image, you have 100,000 objects in one image. So those are 900,000 bounding boxes. So how do you kind of reduce that to kind of get the right amount? Because you're not going to be able to process all of them, and it might not be ideal for them. So you kind of have to figure out a way how to deal with that. And so that's where the merging and filtering comes in. So you merge them and you filter them. And then also you have to take into consideration some of the objects were on the boundary as well, particularly the larger objects. So if you have a plane, you don't want to have a large plane, you don't want to have 5 bounding boxes, you just want to have 1, just in case it was split somewhere on the corner between those processes. And so these were some of the things that we worked on. And so generally the ideal framework for object detectors right now generally follow this kind of rule where we have an input image. For this particular, it's a SSD, and we take it through a feature extraction. So that's VGG16, which is the popular deep learning approach, and then we add additional convolutions to create feature maps. We do the region proposals, or we detect regions of interest, and then we put it through non-maximum suppression, which reduces the number of bounding boxes that are given through the the anchors. And so this was kind of what the inference pipeline would look like. So this was the inference approach, where we have 5 different models, we each with different specifications and different. So for this particular instance, they had different ways in which we had altered the image. So sometimes we'd have different inputs. We'd alter the inputs in different ways. So sometimes we zoom in, we zoom out, and so it was mainly an input augmentation strategy to try and get all the little different objects that are in an image, as well as filtering it in the sense of having a threshold value for the confidence. So we try to use as much information as we can in order to get the best results that we could. And so jumping into that, these are kind of the results that we had. And so we used the mean average precision. And so as I mentioned, we kind of had the small, medium, large, common, rare, and final score. And so we can see that according to the results, we had the training, testing, and sequestered. And this is kind of important because whenever we do the training, we want to actually make sure we know how robust our models are. And so for this instance, the sequestered, we didn't see what it was. We don't know images that were there. We don't know anything about it. We haven't seen it, and so we're not sure what it was about. But we can see that the model was pretty good, or it was okay with minimal loss. The testing, we don't know. We saw the images, but we didn't really see. We didn't have the labels. So that's a lot of this is just only the only thing we knew was the training aspect of it, and that's kind of where we are. And we can see that for the small, it was a challenge because trying to get to see those small, little, tiny cars is very difficult from that point. Continuing on, this was like a class by class, what you call it, performance, or MAP. I think it's a little bit small, but that's due to like kind of the number of classes. But we can see that we had really bad performance in the shed, the trucks, one of the trucks, the pickup truck, and the utility truck. And so it's understandable when you have 6 different trucks, it's kind of difficult to kind of define which one it is whenever you're looking at it from a satellite point of view. These were the final results for the challenge. You can see the score was not really high in general. I think that this is the really difficult problem, particularly dealing with high resolution satellite images. It's not pretty trivial because of all the challenges that I've kind of mentioned. And so we did come out third, but you can see all the scores were below 30. We had hoped that we'd do better, but I mean, that was what happened. Observation. So to continue this work and moving in a different direction of, moving the same direction of research that we're going, we're trying to capitalize on context, whether it's spatial or semantic. And so we kind of just looked at like what these objects kind of, these images kind of just show us what are the relations. So you can see this is a co-occurrence matrix, and you can see there are places where there's a deep hue where these classes kind of come together. And so we're hoping that this could be used to somehow leverage and improve the results, as well as the spatial, which is on the right-hand side, where we kind of look at where these objects are placed and how far apart they are. And so to continue on that, so most of the work we're going to try and do from now is to use metadata as part of the training. We've started using part of that, so anything that's part, whether it's the GSD or whatever the case may be, we're trying to incorporate that to the training, whether it's dealing with the bounding box regression or whatever the case may be. And then we'll integrate more spatial and semantic relationships to improve labeling, so maybe using human knowledge as a way to do that. We're also working right now with the temporal analysis of satellite images, trying to look at images through a sequence of time, particularly for now we're dealing with just RGB images, but we're hoping to have more channels, to increase the number of channels. And then finally, yeah, we're working towards getting a proposal submitted for an IARPA program that deals with that for various construction and human activities, just to monitor what is going on. And yeah, I think that's kind of everything that I have.
We have all the speakers of the session for a final Q&A session on the panel. And those of you who have questions, please come to the mics. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Gilbert, I had a quick question for you. Well, actually two. I think it was the mean, your second distribution, right? Yes. Do you have a similar figure where you can compare the distribution of classes that you actually see once you've run it through your deep learning pipeline to compare to what the truth values are? That would be really, do you have something like that? Or do you have an idea of what that looks like?
It's on?
Yes.
At the moment, we don't really have the labeling of the classes, the true ground truth for the validation. But if we did, yeah, we would probably have it. We've tried to do that kind of analysis, but it's not conclusive because it's not the actual ground truth.
Sure. And the other thing I wanted to ask was, there must be somewhere some GPU that can be used for educational purposes. I hope you can find one, please.
I know that Google
For
has
free.
on Google Colab.
Because
But
the CPU.
They have a
It's
CPU, but
brutal.
I know it's for like, it's not really big. Like I think you can only get like MNIST, but it's good like to kind of I guess prototype.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, one resource is AWS. You can apply for a research grant, and they will give you credit to use on AWS.
Yeah.
And then I had maybe kind of comment question for Itya and Eric. With respect to data set size, because you show some really interesting results, I think it might be really even more interesting to demonstrate the limitations or the strengths even of limiting the amount of data you use to reach, say, similar accuracy or results in segmentation. So have you all followed up with any studies like that or currently in progress? I think that would be really valuable for the community, by the way, because you know how much data you need for some kind of task, for example.
Yeah, it would be super valuable to get like an intuition, more or less. For this particular problem, we did multiple iterations, starting out with a smaller data set and then evaluating results, feeding in those results for multiple times to slowly build out the training data set. And after maybe about 2 times of that, we started noticing a little bit of capping out on performance. But we haven't done a more full-fledged study than kind of like eyeballing and just seeing if this is giving you a lift or not. I don't know.
So that's one of the reasons we limited the number of bands we used, because we knew that the more complex the model we made, we would have to use more samples. And since Hyperion images are limited as is, and you don't want to sample one field twice because of issues of autocorrelation, we can't really generate as many samples as we would like. So what we did was try to limit the bands as much as possible and generate as many samples as possible without that issue of autocorrelation. One big challenge in SVMs, at least, is the parameter optimization. It's very time consuming, and I know there are ways to automate it, but I haven't been able to figure out how I could implement that within Google Earth Vision.
Precisely this.
Yes, I had a figure. I found it. So this is from the
This is from Cosmic, no?
from Cosmic Q, who works on the SpaceNet data. So this shows the accuracy versus the number of training images.
Yeah.
It's one of the few studies that people have done on this, but yeah, we need more of that definitely.
Yeah.
For this problem in particular, because we had an intuition that it was, we wouldn't have much training data, we decided to use a little bit more of a scaled down version of the UNet in order to have fewer parameters that would need to be trained. So,
Oh, sorry.
yeah.
What's the training like, time-wise, computationally?
Time-wise, it's quite fast, I'd say. Like, just because our training data would fit into a 1080s visual memory.
Cool.
So not a lot of transfer that would slow down the model training. Probably under a half hour for a single model to train.
You could also choose a machine learning algorithm that doesn't need as much parameterization. So, for example, in our projects, we've had pretty good success with the random forest, and we don't need to do that heavy parameterization. The SVM results were a little better in my case, but you have to see, does it justify the efforts needed for parameterization?
At the very least, it's a really nice baseline from which to build, no? Thank you.
So I had a question for the whole panel, but also specifically for the first 2 speakers on hyperspectral, which is, given what you did, where would you like to see ARD protocols in 3 years, so you'd have done half the work to get the same result?
Well, the thing is, if you are talking about ARD from space-borne data, especially to cover the planet, we still don't have enough satellites up there, and that's the biggest limitation we'll have. And I hope the CubeSats will address this issue of having a constellation. You need a constellation to solve this issue. So, of sufficient number of satellites, and then of course you can have all sorts of ARD data using, either, in the hyperspectral remote sensing, the concept is you can acquire all the data, and then for every application, you can pull up all the data you need for specific bands and ignore the rest, or use the entire spectral library depending upon your need.
A little follow-up on that one, because I was thinking about that issue. We've talked in interoperability terms about the imagery and about the training sets, but I haven't heard a discussion yet, and I've only been here today, but I haven't heard a discussion about how a spectral library, for instance, would be shared, and what standards we might want to develop around those.
Yeah, that's, this is exactly due to the challenge of having spectral libraries, especially unrich spectral libraries that work, and and that you can replicate and independently is not an easy thing. But we'll release our first spectral library, at least from Hyperion data for United States, somewhere probably end of this year or early next year. So you can then have a look at that, and then
Look forward to learning by example. Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, I know. That's one of the reasons why we don't have extensive spectral libraries of vegetation, because there are so many different things that contribute to variability in those spectral profiles. So that's why we're really emphasizing having as much information about the conditions in which those spectra were taken as possible, what AEZ they were in, what growth stage were the crops in, of course, what crop type, and then how productive was it. And that's why we need really, really detailed ground reference data so that we can know exactly what we're looking at from the satellite. So that would be really cool.
The one way we are addressing at present is, at least for US, you have CDL, which is kind of a gold standard, and based on the cropping calendar for every agroecological zone, more or less when they follow that pattern. And that's the reason to enrich this one. We try to get data from multiple years so that we are sufficiently clear this is what it means for, say, for example, growth stage 8, whatever that is, maybe senescing stage or whatever. We have maybe 500 spectral collections spread across that area, and then we have, both the distribution of that and as what is representative spectra of that.
So I think we saw an interesting dichotomy between the first two and the last two speakers. The first two dealing almost exclusively with spectral content, and the list of classifiers there, I think, Prasad, you mentioned, you use mainly random forest and SVMs. And the second two guys were doing deep learning, I'm assuming neural nets, correct? Where you were relying almost exclusively, not exclusively, but pretty heavily on the spatial context of, you're looking for blobs. Blobology is sometimes the way it's referred to. I think, Gilbert, you mentioned like 3 bands is what you were looking at. Eric, I think you mentioned you were looking at all the scenes in Sentinel, or bands of Sentinel-2, right? So it'd be interesting to see a similar sensitivity analysis curve that Hamad just brought up with training samples, but with respect to spectra in terms of the bands you used. So I don't know if I missed it, if you did any kind of analysis like that. For example, could RGB have yielded you similar results and you wouldn't have needed all the bands, that kind of a thing. But so that's one issue to kind of resolve going forward, is what are we going to do with this deep learning era that's just booming right now, but it's really heavily connected to the spatial side. I think this is going to be more on the spectral and temporal, the time series. The second big thing, sorry for this long-winded question, but so we've seen or heard a lot this week about the exquisite calibration that goes on. Minsu, went through quite a bit of detail there to get to accuracy rates, right? And I think in the case of Hyperion, the accuracy is quoted of the absolute radiometric accuracy, something like 6% or better. Does that mean anything in terms of classifying, the veg classes that the two hyperspectral talks were getting into? Had it been 10% or 15 or 3%? I mean, do you factor that in at all? So that's another aspect of you've got this CalBal community doing a lot of exquisite work, don't even know if the machine modeling or the machine learning community even uses that, let alone understand how it impacts the results of the classification results. So I'll put that question, the last question, to Prasad.
To answer your first question, which is actually, have we done, for example, what is, how many spectral bands are required to really achieve this? Can we do it in few bands? And this kind of a thing that we have done, I think, extensive work, and at least have published some 30 papers on this. And my experience in this is, and I think also shown by some other results, is typically, and ETIA's results also, and I was telling ETIA when she was doing this work, you will hit optimal between 15 and 20 bands, remember? And she wouldn't believe me, in the sense whatever my experience, and it was actually hitting 15 to 20 bands you reach optimal, at least for agriculture. But I won't say that this is going to be for every other, for example, for forest, it's much more complicated. And it also depends upon whether you are classifying 10 crops, 8 crops, and those kind of things. But we are typically looking at, say, 5, 6 crops in a given area, which is quite complex by agricultural standards in a given area, and then we could achieve that kind of a thing. And the richness of reference data will define your accurate uncertainties in training your machine learning algorithm is heavily dependent upon the richness of your reference data set. And I have a hypothesis which basically says that no matter how much samples that you collect, is good representation, but at the same time, it is just, if you look at the overall Landsat imagery, how many pixels you have there and how many samples you really do to collect this is just less than 1% of the sample, for the training that data. So your training data should be very, very sophisticated and correct in that kind of a scenario. So that's where your uncertainty is.
No, so I understand all that in terms of having good representative training data, but it's the radiometric calibration that we've spent a lot of time talking about in terms of harmonizing or combining different sensor sets. Where does that come in? Does it get used, and how? So it can help, I think, the CalBal side understand where's this uncertainty information going to the next level of processing. I don't think that connection's really been made. And so I think that's a disconnect within this community is what I'm pointing out.
Yeah. Maybe you can answer. Let me start. For example, when you get something like Hyperion data, you get, digital numbers, you convert into radians, reflectance, and all that. And there is going to be certain amount of, the quality of data is quality of data, that you can't change that one. But what we have done is also done this at various levels and using spaceborne, airborne, and ground-based data. So when you are talking about airborne and ground-based, it is much more accurate in terms of both radiometry and atmospheric effects and all those kind of things. You will have much more reliability in that. And when you talk about Hyperion data from spaceborne sensor, the only uncertainty we'll have is in atmospheric correction because of certain limitations we'll have. You want to add to that?
So one way that we deal with low signal to noise ratios and et cetera is by relying on our experience on the ground and our basic knowledge of what data should look like. So for example, with the Hyperion spectra, we know that certain bands are full of noise, and so we don't use those bands in our analyses. And then we also visually inspect those data and make sure that there aren't very noisy spectra in our training sets. So we could go about it two ways. We could have really huge training sets and introduce noise that could make models robust, or we could have very few but very well selected training data, which is the approach that we took. And then for the first question, there are actually people working on that exact issue. So I attended a deep learning seminar or workshop really in Flagstaff hosted by someone from NAU. And we did some activities on the last day in a few hours looking at how we can implement those deep learning methods on our data sets. So I was trying to implement that in my hyperspectral data set. And what I found is, for me, the way I would approach it is do principal components analyses or some way to have components that would summarize data across several bands and then put 3 components into the neural networks. But there are also other people at NAU and throughout who are using hyperspectral data and are able to actually put all those bands into neural nets. Now, this is something I need to look more into, but they are out there. So.
I mean, I do agree with her that that's how people in deep learning are doing it. You do something like PCA and all that, and then you get the best features, and then you go through a network. But you can also include bands, additional bands in the training. It's the only issue is that you might have to. It's about how you initialize the network, right? So a lot of times we initialize the network using, let's say, ImageNet or MS Coco or wherever the case may be. Those images are in 3 bands. And so what you'd have to do is probably start from scratch and find a way to initialize the network well. So maybe a better way to initialize the network would also be the same way, maybe use an autoencoder or something to get the weights. So this is something we are currently working on and we'll see how the results come out.
For our problem in particular, we saw model lift in using 9 bands versus like the RGB bands. But something that we definitely should have, or we could have tested more, is using a PCA approach to try to go from 9 bands to 3 bands, just to at least reduce the number of parameters that a model would need to learn. And that's always something that's good to strive for.
And PCAs are really good for summarizing information over a lot of variables, but it really depends on your goal. So if it's classification, then maybe a discriminant analysis would be better for summarizing that information, or some various other techniques that don't just summarize the information without an objective in mind.
The other limitation with something like PCA is that, okay, it reduces the dimension and gives you maybe 3 or 4 where it explains, say, let us say 95% of the variability. The problem is that every principal component is a function of, say, let us say 70 bands or 80 bands, and it boils down to 1 band. Physically, you can't explain what is that is happening physically. You know, that's a limitation. Okay, so if you are trying to understand, for example, a lignin, you need to understand which band it is, and that gets lost in this kind of thing.
I will say that later. It's working? Okay. Yeah, so we worked on Sentinel-2, the same kind of approach that Eric was mentioning for land cover classification, but it was a pixel-based classification using random forest, so no deep learning. But we used 4 bands, just the RGB and NIR, and the other time we used the other extra 4 bands, including the red edges, and those are 20 meter, right? So the question was, okay, if we downsample those, we are adding noise. Does it really add value? And it does. So we basically do a very simple SP line. We convert the 20 meter to 10 meter, and then we use them in the random forest. It adds almost 10% to the classification accuracy for particularly vegetation classes. Yeah, we will publish those, but it's the same thing. That sometimes you think it's adding noise because of the resolution or others, but it's actually adding value.
Sorry, I just want to add to this discussion on machine learning. My own experience, having worked before the cloud computing came into effect, is that I always preferred unsupervised classification, because computers can classify more things than what human eyes can see. And by doing a supervised pixel-based classifiers like random forest and support vector machines, we select classes based on our samples, but it's still a limitation because it depends upon your training data, and you can't get training data enough. That's a limitation really. And that way you actually compromise the data itself.
So I guess I'll start with the issue of the training data, because it will lead into a question that I don't think Pete got a chance to ask. It seems like there's a lot of airborne data. I'm aware of a lot of it, even at a Goddard, a lot of UAS data where people are flying specific field targets, for instance, where there's a lot of information about the crop, the condition of the crop. And it seems to me that would be a better training data set. So that's the first part. The other is that kind of data, I think, could help us answer a question about what is the real signal to noise required in a hyperspectral imager, because signal to noise requirements usually blow us out of the water because you just don't have enough photons if you're moving 7 kilometers per second across the landscape, even at large aperture sizes in some cases. So it seems like once you train this, you can then introduce the noise as a random variable and see at what point it breaks, right? You take a scene that's got good SNR, and then you degrade it and put it back into your classifier and see if it still classifies properly. It would be very useful for people developing systems to have a more rigorous specification for what's actually needed.
So that's what we're working on, or we're working towards with the GISA website. Right now we've just incorporated Hyperion data, but we are working with partners and collaborators who would bring in those average data or ground data to help build an even more robust library. So that is in the works.
Yeah. For example, NASA flew Everest NG over India maybe a year back or so. We have the entire data with us. That's one of our goals. There are 2 problems with that. It's exactly same like what you do. For example, when you do Landsat classification using very high spatial resolution data as a training data set, you have limitation. You have not that much limitation because you still get a lot of data as a sample. But when you are talking about hyperspectral overflow, there is very limited data, or especially if you consider the entire planet. Okay, certain areas like California might be very well flown, but not many other parts of the world. And we are, for example, for us to build spectral library, we need to have very precise ground data, and that is what is lacking elsewhere. And even data from whether it is airborne. That's why in this spectral library we are trying to not limit ourselves to what we are doing, but we want to bring the entire community. And in this community, we have contacted a lot of people all over the world who are working, who are kind of these specialists in this area, and have been. But we want to do the first cut and show that, okay, here is that we have done it for US. Now, will you be able to share this? This is a problem that we have all over the world, that people have sometimes fantastic data for certain small areas, but they don't share it, and now probably will convince some of them to do it.
Okay. Sounds like then you'll try the SNR. Just turn the knob until it breaks and then let us know what that is.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, I just want to make a comment on the previous question on whether, well, basically how much does Cal-Val matter, right? In my view, I don't think it matters as much for in classical research experiments. For example, you have a given data set, you make a split, and the training part is going to have the same distribution as the test part. So it doesn't really matter what units or normalization it has, you will probably have the same final accuracy. But I think that Cal-Val is super important whenever you are deploying ML in production. And so where the data that you're deploying it on in the future, you're not sure if it's going to have the same distribution as the one you trained on. Of course, kind of come from many sensors and so on. So if you take the approach of adding noise, that suddenly very quickly becomes untractable because you always need to keep adding more and more noise so that you're sure that distribution is what you think it is. So I want to make the distinction that research experiments and ML for production really have this, are really different in many ways, and this is one case where Cal-Val is absolutely necessary. Not necessarily the units themselves, but just the standardization of it.
I have a question or a small comment about this idea of using PCA to reduce the amount of data on which one you need to train. But if you do that, maybe the feature because at the end you have the same amount of dimension, you just kick out the last ones. But maybe the important information is in the last ones, no? Maybe it's the first ones that you need to kick out.
So that's why you can't blindly choose which principal component you want to use. You have to look at the eigenvalues and eigenvectors and see, okay, so which bands did they say are most useful? And that's what we ended up doing. We looked at which bands were most useful most often, and then we chose those bands as most important.
But how you know which one is the most useful?
The weightings.
From the PCA?
Loadings, yes.
Oh, okay. No, from the PCA, you mean?
Yeah, from the PCA.
Yeah,
So
but it's not because stuff are very correlated that are maybe more useful. I mean, or more sparse. It's maybe the very small, tiny variation at the end.
I think you have a brilliant point. What you mean is that, okay, there is a principal component which is, let us say, 6th or 7th or 8th principal component, which explain 1%, 0.5% variability, but that's an important.
Is a person we are maybe looking for?
It's an extremely important thing for a specific feature.
Yeah.
So that's a well-known. So the approach we take is, suppose if you are doing a classification of, say, let us say crop types, if you have first 3 principal components which explain, let us say, 98% of variability, we use those 3 principal components to do the classification, because this is a combination of hundreds of bands of data that it's being, integrated into these single bands, and you might be able to classify. But if you are trying to model, say, for example, a lignin or starch or something like that, then you need a specific bands which you can't eliminate. And for that one, in fact, we will not be using principal component, but we'll be actually going into that particular band. Maybe it is 2350 nanometer, pick it up and then use that as an index to model that variable that you see is very important for that particular features. So if you miss in principal component, 3 principal component to classify a crop, what might happen is you might explain your accuracy might be, your producer user accuracy might be something like 90% and up, and we might say, okay, this is what we can accept. And for doing the crop classification. But you can't accept that for modeling a particular biophysical or biochemical quantity. For that one, you can't use, this is what I mentioned earlier, you can't use principal component, you have to use the particular band, which is very important.
And that's why we ended up choosing the optimal hyperspectral narrow bands rather than using the components themselves to tie in that biophysical and biochemical meaning.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
I will think about it.
Another way of kind of doing that is you do a first kind of classification using all the bands, and then add noise to one specific band. That will give you two things. One is how much reduction you get in the basically prediction accuracy. The other part is you can see which part of the network activate because of that noise. Then you can map how that information, because that's one of the questions you always get, oh, it's a black box. We don't see what's happening inside a machine learning model. But that way you can actually see, by changing that feature input, which is the band in this case, which part of the network is being activated or deactivated, you can see the change, and how it's impacting your output result. Then you as a modeler, it needs now the domain knowledge. I want to include that band or not? Does it really matter in terms of my class accuracy or not? That's another way people are doing something in that direction in the computer vision too.
Yeah, so another dichotomous dynamic that's, I'm not saying that that's bad, just, you know, we have a number of different kind of application areas, I think, represented across this ARD, which is good, right? So a lot of folks this week talked about measuring change over time, right? Time series, right? And so that's where the cal, you know, obviously matters a lot. So you can have everything consistent through time. Whereas using Hyperion, it's more of a maybe one scene per, what is it, a couple of years or something. I mean, it's probably a revisit of pretty long, right? What is it? What's the revisit of it?
With Hyperion, it was task driven. So
Right.
someone asks for those data to be recorded and then they're recorded. So it really depends on what requests they received. So
Right.
for example, some regions in California had several passes very quickly throughout the growing season. They were studying some particular plant or whatever. While other areas haven't had any interest or very little interest in 1 year. So instead of getting several passes for a growing season over multiple years, we have one image for one growing season
Right.
in 1 year.
Yeah, actually, it's what, a 7.5 kilometer swath. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
I mean,
that's
it's the
the
nature of the
problem.
beast. You're limited on revisit. I mean, that's just, you know, the nature of it. But I guess where I was going with this question is, so here's this deep learning thing that's really taken off. You know, heavily based on spatial aspects and context of what's in the scene. So here we have this time series community looking at spectra through time, right? Looking at the coefficients of a regression fit of data point observations through time. That's something that could be looked at with deep learning algorithms, correct? And I'd be curious as to what the two guys who presented on deep learning think about that. And you know, is that an area ripe for investigation for this community?
I would have to say yes. I think time series analysis in terms of deep learning is a very interesting aspect to look at. I think by using LSTMs in deep learning, being able to extract the features and use LSTMs, we'll be able to get a lot more information over a large amount of data. So I think whenever you're dealing with deep learning, it has to be quite a large amount of data in order for you to actually show some results. And so if I don't think I found like enough data to kind of get those experiments and have those results at the moment. But it should show promise ideally.
Yeah, so I specifically haven't done time series work with deep learning models. But I know there are groups out there comparing results between LSTMs and other traditional time series modeling techniques, and it's very kind of problem dependent and a little bit open to discussion on the future of that.
I mean, it's diverse. The goal is just to be as diverse as possible. The LSTMs have shown to be very robust. If you know how to like train them, you'll get pretty decent results. The work that has been done has been mostly on video analysis of like daily activities. and in that area, it has shown a lot of promise over a long period of time.
So during my PhD work, I actually did use ground level data that were repeated, and I put them into a support vector machine. So it wasn't necessarily a time series analysis in that I didn't observe the changes through time, but I did use those multiple sampling methods through time, especially through the growing season, to make a more robust training data set, so that the model could see, okay, so this crop looks like this as it goes through the season. Here's all that variability. Now, even despite that variability, could we differentiate plant species? And we did get some decent results.
Thank you. In the interest of time, because we have a small panel now, right, Ignacio? So let's thank our speakers once again. And if you want to take a 2 or 3 minute stretch break, do that. But we want to start the next panel quickly. Ignacio, you have something?
Okay, just a couple of minutes, because then we're going to give you a little update of what happened in the room next door. Are people coming back?
We'll wait till they come back.
Yeah.
And of course.
Right, let's get our next speaker. Jim Ellenwood is going to walk us through thinking differently about how we look and use our data. So we're going to do a short talk, and then we're going to invite some possible speakers. I want to say even volunteers. So I really want you to be alert during the talk and save your best questions to the end. And if you feel really strongly, don't even ask the questions. Just come to the front and let's have a nice, intimate conversation about a different way to look at the data before we go home. You have a microphone.
Thanks. Thanks, Ignacio. My name's Jim Ellenwood. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm an actual forester, but I'm the National Program Lead for Monitoring, Remote Sensing, and Geospatial Analysis Research, and I'm based in the national headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I'm a tree person. I was wondering how many of you consider yourselves, do you work with trees? And so just a handful. Which is ironic, because when I ask the same question in the Washington office headquarters, I get about the same response. Yeah, but really, I've been a tree person, and I started my career almost 35 years ago, about the time when Landsat 5 came on the scene. And remote sensing has always been one of the tools of foresters, but back then it was pretty much aerial photography. In fact, we used aerial photography to get around in the woods because we didn't have GPS. We would be interpreting imagery to figure out where we are so we knew where the resources were, and we'd bring back to the office and go through various things to try to make it usable in a spatial context. And I thought that would work, but... No, use the arrows. Arrows? Okay. See, I got lost quickly without direction. So anyways, the U.S. Forest Service, it's part of USDA. Our fundings come through the Department of Interior appropriations, so our funding is no way connected with USDA, but administratively, and we're tied with them. There's 3 main deputy areas within the Forest Service. The National Forest Systems is the one most people are familiar with. It's the part that manages the 193 million acres of national forests that are in the ownership of the USDA Forest Service. Another branch is state and private forestry. You've heard of them a lot because that's the cooperative unit that works with other agencies and fires, other states and other agencies in fighting fires, as well as forest health issues, cooperative extension, Smoky Bear, and various other things that are kind of more of an extension type service that isn't tied to actually managing the land, but in terms of cooperating in the control of various issues within in forestry. And then there's research and development. That's the unit that I'm part of. It's only about 7% of the overall budget, so R&D is very small, and remote sensing within R&D is even smaller. In fact, it's so small. I know exactly what my budget is, and it's not even measurable. But either way, we have 59 scientists. We have about 450 scientists in R&D. 59 of them claim in their directories that they have a keyword of remote sensing in there, so they claim they do some element of remote sensing. And it's interesting to see the list. I know half of them fairly well, but most of them are really not remote sensing specialists or scientists. They're really a landscape ecologist or a social scientists or various other things, or geographers. They're really not majorly remote sensing, but they team up a lot with universities and other agencies. We get a lot of funding through NASA to cooperate in carbon monitoring, as various other projects. So that keeps our scientists going in using remote sensing. The National Forest Inventory, done through our Forest Inventory and Analysis Group, is a pretty big thing. It's about almost a quarter to a third of the R&D budget, and that's implemented throughout all 50 states as well as the territories, where we regularly inventory in a continuous fashion forest plots throughout the United States. And it helps us in terms of doing carbon monitoring, as well as the state of the forest and various things like that. And I work very closely in conjunction with them in delivering my program. A lot of the remote sensing that is done in the Forest Service is small project areas covering portions of national forest. There's a couple of regional efforts, but really national efforts are not a big thing. In fact, there's very few national efforts that are done. Landscape change monitoring system is probably the biggest one at the moment. We are a cooperative with the multi-resolution land cover cooperative with other agencies. We provide the tree canopy cover layer every 5 years. And I did want to mention that the MRLC cooperative, because I mean that's been going since the early 90s. 91 I think was the first product series that they developed, and they were collating Landsat imagery into data sets, data cubes, mosaics, to do the National Land Cover data set, impervious surfaces and stuff like that. And in about the mid-2000s, you know, they were working in 2001, they created these data stacks, and that was really the initial stages of ARD. I think with USGS, with that subset of USGS working on that, they were producing these standardized data sets for which to do analysis. And in fact, I grabbed some of that data, the data for the US, and took our FIA data and modeled individual tree species and used that for our forest health monitoring. And I actually produced a tree atlas of 264 species that were modeled from the MRLC data stacks that were collated in 2001. And it was, we had over 250,000 machine learning models that built into this, all independent. It was a nightmare, but it was long done, and then I left that part of the Forest Service and came to the Washington office, so it was my escape. But either way, it wouldn't have happened if we didn't have this analysis-ready data to do that. And so that's been my concept of ARD. After today, I realize it's not as well defined. In fact, based on the examples I saw, I thought instead of analysis-ready data, it may be agriculture-ready data, but that's besides the point. Maybe I can make it FRD, but let's take a look at, NLCD is pretty much a big national product. It's at 30 meters. That's what a lot of our efforts have been done with the Forest Service and various other forest applications at the 30-meter scale. And 1-meter data sets are popping up here and there, and we want to take advantage of it. But if we want to do it in a national scale, it's a very difficult thing to do. For one, it's not available, and I think there was one effort that was funded by NASA and Louisiana State University where they took the NAPE, National Agricultural Imagery, 1-meter data set and made a tree, presence, absence of tree canopy across the lower 48, never released. I mean, the accuracy assessment was, but it's a high-resolution data set at 1 meter. And then I thought about that. That's, you know, is that really the direction we want to go? And that's sort of motivating me in this talk today. Going to 1 meter from 30 meters is a huge jump, and there's a lot of things that we think in terms of when we stratify our modeling efforts, it will lower variance and stuff like that. So there could be potential for great benefits, but there's a potential for great issues with going with that 1 meter working in two-dimensional space, and maybe we'll simplify that. There's probably far better in photogrammetry than I am. I had basically one lab in a forest maturation course 39 years ago, so I won't profess to really understand it. But looking at Landsat at the 30 meters and tree heights, when you're at nadir, no big deal, but when you're towards the edge of the imagery or way off nadir, in the eastern US, a typical tree is maybe 25 meters in height. You may vary, the top of the tree may differ from the bottom of the tree on the edge based on the angle by maybe 3 meters or so. And in the western US where you have 80-meter trees, it's maybe 10 meters. For Landsat at 30 meter, probably not a big deal. But when you start getting to Sentinel, well now if you look at the taller trees, 80-meter trees, maybe 14 meters off the top from the bottom. And that's more than a pixel size. And then if you start looking at our NAPE imagery, it could be 64 meters off, which is 64. So it could be quite a bit off. And in fact, we use a lot of the NAPE imagery to come up with canopy cover estimates that we use to feed into our 30-meter stuff. And so our base data is problematic. And in fact, our Western scientists say, wow, we don't like this tree canopy product because it's off by 22%. If it goes 0 to 100, 22% is a quarter of the whole dynamic range of that product. So it is problematic, and the reason is because we're looking in a two-dimensional sense of three-dimensional objects, which are the tree heights. So there's great potential there. And so looking at how we look at things in a vertical sense, we could see the flattening of the trees. We don't know if those are trees or shrubs because we can't really see the height. If we look in an oblique, we could obviously see the trees, and we could see in this a 3D shot next to a two-dimensional shot. It is a big difference seeing a 3D representation of it. So that's a really big thing, looking things in that third dimension. So take a look at here, our scale considerations. We're doing a lot of things at 240 and 30 meters. How much of an area that covers in terms of the size of the rasters. Not really much when you're looking at the country, only 15 megabytes, 15 billion pixels cover a 30-meter data set for the whole US. Once we start getting the 10-meter and 1 meter, that billion becomes trillion, 13 trillion to cover the whole US. Start looking even smaller than 1 meter, a half meter, or even eighth of a meter, we're starting to get almost a petapixel in size. And if we started to looking at tree characteristics across that, for us to store that and just do it, it becomes next to impossible. So at what point do managing pixels really matter? And for us, if we look at the current estimates of the number of trees in the US on forested land, it's about 380 billion trees. And it's a lot easier to manage 380 billion objects than it is nearly a petabyte of pixels. And at that smaller resolution, we're not really getting any more because what we're really interested in is the trees and the trees aggregated in the forest. Google Earth, I know I was talking to one of the reps here. They have a thing to visualize in 3D, as part of Google Maps. And it's a great source because what I'm seeing in Google Maps just thrills me. I don't know if that's going to work. Ah, darn. Oh well. It actually rotates and shows the 3D objects. But anyways, the 3D object is really what amazes me, because really that object of the crown, that's a measurement we don't do in the forest. And to me, that's everything. What a tree can accrete, how it occupies the site, how much carbon there is, how much support it needs in terms of the structure, which is basically the merchantable part of the tree, those are the things that are already measured in this optical image, and it's something that it would be great way to stabilize some of the things we're trying to estimate. The way we're doing it now, it just really, that jump from the high resolution imagery to what we're measuring on the ground versus what we're projecting across the nation, I mean, that really would be a very stabilizing force. And so I really see how things are progressing, you know, from what we had 30 years ago versus what we have now versus what we may have 30 years in the future. You know, computing resources are only going to get better. Availability of 3D objects are certainly going to be a potential. When we say analysis-ready data, perhaps analysis-ready objects might be the way that we may be looking for in terms of forest because of the issues that we have at high resolution. And that's sort of what I was trying to come out with in this talk. Lots of high resolution imagery. Can we really use it unless we start looking in that 3D sense? It's a great opportunity, but I think that the struggle to use it can be mitigated by looking at these 3D objects in some regard. And I think when you're talking about ARD in forest, you might need to bring some third dimensional component in there. I think that's where I was. So based on the latest estimate, Forest Service, 380 billion trees, 380 billion objects. We don't even need all of them because we're sample-based. You know, our current FIA inventory is sample-based. It's 136,000th sample. We basically are measuring 136,000th the area of the U.S. to basically come up with our current estimates. And really, even 380 billion objects is only like 10 million tree objects on our sample sites. So it's not as bad. We could actually increase it by sixfold and make it 60 million, and really it's not that big of a deal. So I guess the question I was throwing out, at what point does it make sense to start using individual tree approach in light of ARD? Is that something that people are willing to kick around? And that's where I want to start our discussion. And then the last thing I wanted to do, I know Microsoft has a thing that projects age, and I thought this was interesting because, you know, I talk about my 34-year career, and so I started when I was 4, based on the AI. And what kills me, it had the information there. It says Old Forester right next to me, and why it didn't take that information, I don't know. But with that, we could start our discussion. So I thought, where's Ignacio? Did he? Oh, he was gonna co-moderate with me. Okay.
Customer yesterday, who I can't name, but they want to map 120 million trees in California as individual objects. So I think they're, at least on the commercial side,
yeah.
there are folks seriously talking about that, and they're planning to do it using LiDAR data in combination with multispectral.
There's a commercial entity called EarthDefine. They basically have 5 billion objects in the state of California that they modeled through a combination of the NAPE. And I thought they used some of the LiDAR, but there wasn't that much LiDAR to go with. But that's EarthDefine based in Seattle, or near Seattle, Redmond, I think.
Yeah. Embarrassingly, we don't have wall-to-wall LiDAR coverage for California.
No.
I can't explain to anybody why.
Yeah, LiDAR is a Western, in the east you got nearly wall-to-wall LiDAR. In the west, since Forest Service is the dominant landowner, and since we're not very well funded, it's by hook or by crook, we get things done. There is a big effort to try to, I think there's maybe 20 or 30 cooperatives to try to get funds together to do the Southern Sierras, to see if they could do that. And they've been trying for 2 years now to get enough funds to do it. There's the Western Snowpack survey that they're trying to do, where they do the samples every week, and accumulating that throughout a season, they might actually have enough, but that's a very small area. You know, to get LiDAR wall-to-wall, USGS has funded the 3DAP program, so they look for partners. So if we could find partners to get other partners, then eventually they'll get the entire US covered. The goal was to do it within 8 years, and they're halfway through, and the West still has a lot of gaps.
The utility sector in California spent $700 million on vegetation management last year.
Wow.
So talk to them.
That's more than the 3-depth budget, I
Yep.
will say.
That's more than our budget.
It's more than the USGS budget, no.
Yeah.
Hey, so quick question for you. So LiDAR is hard to get and infrequent when you do get it. Have you looked at just using the more towards the nadir view of both Sentinel and Landsat? So instead of, because you're giving kind of worst case scenario looking out at the edges. If you use both of them, I mean, it's 2 to 3 day coverage of the country, and they have different ground tracks. So perhaps using more of a nadir view, the nadir portion of both satellites would yield better results instead of trying to go to the edge on each one.
Yeah, I know. Seeing how the now they're sort of not the Fusion, well, the Fusion product.
The HLS. The Fusion product is the one that ESA is making that they don't have over the U.S.
Oh, okay.
So now the HLS product that NASA's producing right now is over the U.S. and that brings the Sentinel to 30 meter, but you get the co-aligned geometry.
Yeah. What I mentioned earlier, at 30 meters, it didn't seem to matter too much because it wasn't that much. It's when we get to the high resolution stuff that it really starts to matter. But let me say about, LiDAR is expensive, but if we could get that initial coverage, we'll at least have the terrain. And then some of the photogrammetric, we'll call it PHOTAR, but the grammetrically derived 3D point clouds, like from NAPE. We have 13 states collected. Wyoming was collected 4 or 5 years ago. Those are potential to act as interim projects to track the growth. And then there's the Polar Research Center. Polar Geospatial. Sorry. Polar Geospatial Center with their taking their worldview imagery and doing the stereo projection at half meter to come up with that point cloud. They got pretty good coverage through the Great Lakes and various spots across the U.S. It's not consistent, but slowly but surely they'll get some pretty good coverage over the next few years. And that would be great if you had a LiDAR base from which to go from. So there's the great potential. I think we'll see tree objects in 10 years. I think my career is probably going to end about the same time Landsat 7 will end, but I'll run out of fuel before then. But I think in the next 10 years we might start seeing these objects, in which case, I mean, we could do objects in the east, wall to wall, right now, and I think that will solve a lot of our issues.
That's where the trees are. So.
Well, it's also it's where they're much more complex in the east. In the west, they're single species and not as diverse.
More questions?
So the earlier presentation, they talked about building geometry and I thought that building objects, and I thought that was interesting because GEOBIA, I mean, I've heard that term for 15 years, and I heard there's standard building objects of or someone's working on that. Is that?
What do you mean? I missed the last session.
What
do you mean building objects?
Well, building objects. I thought there was a group, not ARD, but working on accumulating building objects across the U.S. Is that?
Microsoft
footprints?
released.
Oh, it's
I don't know if
Microsoft.
you're talking about building footprints, but Microsoft released a coterminous U.S. 125 million polygon data set.
Wow.
With every house and every barn. Not perfect, but interesting. Really interesting.
How was it derived?
Machine learning on NAPE. So your NAPE caveats may still apply, but
interesting.
Yeah, it's a start.
The trees are more important to me, but they wouldn't have those buildings without those trees, no.
One of the things we've been looking a lot is stereo products, and we have the ability to partially task portions of our constellation to have different view angles, and there is a natural distribution of observation angles already in the imagery due to how we schedule the satellites. So we're always interested in understanding, are there small deltas to the CONOPS of distributed constellations, so we can collect a stereo baseline that is only every 6 months or so by, surgically tasking a fraction of the capacity to be 20 degrees off or 10 degrees off, looking ahead or behind, for example. But we need the use cases to justify it commercially or a contract.
Yeah.
But we have the capacity on both SkySat platform and the DAP platform. So we're all ears. Any more questions, thoughts? Everybody looks very tired.
It's hard to imagine after 2.5 days of intensive deep learning.
I didn't want to dominate the questions, but I had one more quick question.
Yeah,
which
please,
is
go ahead.
Is the training data for the National Forest Inventory publicly available? Last I looked, it hadn't been, but.
So the geospatial coordinates have privacy issues. So if you look at 135,000 forestry plots, I think we have to deal with maybe 40 or 50,000 owners to get permissions to enter those plots. And part of that permissions is that we are maintaining confidentiality, and it's written into the law that we maintain that. So we can't release the coordinates, but we release the entire data set. And what we have online is coordinates that may be perturbed by as much as a mile. And the way a lot of our people use it is they aggregate the plots into a higher spatial entity, not a county basis or some other type of stratification, which is not great for deep learning. Although adding noise, I heard in the last talk, adding noise might be something, so I don't know. Maybe that's too much noise. But the other question is, if you ever collected GPS, in high density forest, there's a lot of issues with multicasting it, and it doesn't always, even our scientists with the known coordinates have issues with the spatial locations being fairly being somewhat noisy, and it doesn't always work. Sometimes some of them quip that, oh yeah, adding fuzz to the plots makes it better, but I think we're working on that. I know we're looking at survey grade receivers to try to get more precise locations of our plots to help better serve our analytical needs in the future for modeling. But that, you visit some plots every 10 years, and it takes a while to cycle through them because it's 1/10 of the plots every year, so it takes you 10 years to get through all the plots. That's in the West and the U.S. In the eastern U.S., it's every 5 to 7 years. So it takes a while to cycle through.
Would it be possible to split the training set and make publicly available the stuff that's on public land?
That's been kicked around too. They also want to maintain plot integrity. That was the second part of it, and having people visit a plot. That's the issue. They want to keep people off the plot, so the things that go on in the national forests are monitored without any extra disturbance or avoidance or anything like that. It's treated as the rest of the areas on public land. So they're reluctant to release those because you don't know how many people might actually try to visit a plot, in which case you're adding disturbance, in which case it's not like the rest of the other areas within the forest. So the plot integrity is the issue that gets kicked around or gets that idea squashed. But I think a lot of people would like to do that. It's just that concern is they can't seem to get past that.
Thank you. I was always curious why that was.
Yeah. Yep. And that's really the issue, is the plot integrity part of it. But some of these plots go back to 1930. That's how long term these things happen. Most have been implemented within the last 20, 25 years. And now we're getting into our 4th and 5th measurement in the east, and with the latest plot design, and our 2nd and 3rd measurements in the west. So, and now it's a great data set because we could track it through time. And with the historic Landsat archive, it's a great data set to track these changes within the forest that we've never really been able to conceptualize before.
Any other questions? Okay, it's 6 p.m. It's been a really long 3 days. So thank you, Jim. I wanted to thank all of you for coming here. You're very brave. You made it to the end. You're the small group. Some of us are gonna head over to Palo Alto for a last dinner and a quick drink at NOLA's. And I really want to thank you guys for coming. This was pretty amazing. I think I'm personally going to be digesting the outcome of the workshop for the next few days. There's a few action items. We have a survey out, which will be great if you guys can share your insights while it's fresh in your minds. We're going to probably try to either share them in raw form, the results, or write a blog post with the outcomes. We have a Dropbox link that did not work in the building, but I really hope you use when you get back onto your own internet and upload your talk. It's going to be full program, all the talks recorded are going to be put in a YouTube channel, so we're going to splice and publish all the videos. So it should be a lot of really interesting material to nib on as we prepare for the next workshop. So does anyone have any questions about the next workshop? Because there's a couple of things going around, topics going around, like should we do it in the West Coast? Should we try to co-locate it with an existing conference? So there's a couple of threads of conversation. We like the idea of keeping something small, its own thing, but there's always the question of should we co-locate with AGU? Should we co-locate with ASPRS? Should we co-locate with IGARS? So on and so on. What is that? IGARS? No, sorry, I thought there was a conference there because I think IGARS is in, yeah. Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, what I like here, or do it in a facility, that we can use the facility, for free. People can drive from a big geographical area. We don't charge anything for the event. I mean, we charge the sponsors, but we don't charge you guys. So the conversation is open. I just copy-pasted literally the form from last year, which contains a reference to ASPRS with the wrong date. So just ignore that and just say what you want to happen next time, and we're going to tally essentially the input and just make the decision together, hopefully. Yeah, well, thank you. I want to you want to say something? Yes.
Very brief. I want to thank our USGS colleagues, both Daria behind the scene with all the AV and Susan and all the other staff. Yeah, especially Daria. Very smooth transition with everything. Yeah, thank you behind the scene, Daria. And I have a logistical crowdsourcing request. When you're leaving your seat, if you see any trash, please take it out with you. It's making our life much easier. Thank you. And take the food. I mean, there's not much left today, actually, now.